Longevity is booming, and with it, a cascade of new titles. Longevity doctors, longevity consultants, longevity coaches. But what do these labels actually mean? Who defines them? Who controls them? And who verifies the standards behind them? In this episode of the Longevity Playbook, we start at the beginning with the emergence of the longevity coach. Joined by Darren Morris, a former CMO turned longevity coach, and Sarah Edmonds, an international expert in education and professional standards. We unpack what credibility in this space should really look like. This is episode 10, From Hype to Health Outcomes, Making Longevity Coaching Credible. Welcome to this week's episode of the Longevity Playbook. I'm really happy to have our amazing guests joining us this week, Darren Morris and Sarah Edmonds. I'd like to start out with introductions. So Darren, can you kick us off? Connect the dots between where you started in your career to where you are today.
Okay, yeah, going back kind of quite a while really. So my 25 years preceding what I do now has been in the corporate world. All of those years spent in marketing positions, but ultimately I was marketing director, CMO for companies like Pepsi, Carlsberg, Halfords, and then most latterly venture capital based e-commerce businesses. Lots of international travel, lots of high profile roles, lots of high pressure roles. And I guess that was the seed for what's led me to ultimately where I am now, 25 plus years later. Because I guess I realized really early on that in order to survive and thrive in those kind of environments, I needed to invest in myself and ultimately, in my health and my wellness. Because, as is normal for most people, it's not just the professional side of life, it's the personal side of life as well. So at the time, I had a young family. I was doing a ridiculous commute to the office because we didn't want to live in London. So we lived sensibly the complete opposite side of the country. So I was doing, a 5-hour kind of round commute pretty much every day.
Oh.
Young kids, I was competing at a decent level in triathlons, so I had to fit training in. You want to turn up for work and you want to turn up at home. So, as I say, sort of what started with fitness as a means to keep me energized and also to manage the stresses, over the years gradually crept into more and more different areas as I started to educate myself on how can I stay performing at home and at work at a high level. So what started with fitness became nutrition as well. Then, and these are all things that when you go back many years, sleep wasn't really on the radar. Sleep was just something that you did when you kind of, at the end of the day, it wasn't seen as, such an important pillar for your overall kind of health and well-being. But
hustle culture, sleep was not celebrated.
I know.
For wimps, sleep was for wimps, wasn't it? Wasn't that the phrase?
So sleep, and then obviously sort of, managing stress and stress optimization. And over the years, that sort of then expanded out into mindfulness and breath work and all of these things that we now kind of are quite familiar with. Kind of were not necessarily sort of that familiar then, or were seen as a bit woo-woo. Kind of, if you were doing breath work before a meeting and things like that. So I spent throughout all of that professional and corporate career, sort of learning, educating, practicing. All of the things that I guess kind of, now are higher up on the agenda, and also things that I use in my new career. So it was about 3 years ago. I was on holiday. I was in the last job that I had there as a CMO for an e-commerce business, although it was more of a kind of chief operating officer. I just didn't really want to do it anymore, if I'm honest. I had one of those moments where I kind of thought, I'm ironically, I'm running out of energy, but it was more mental energy to actually kind of, continue that, and the thought of continuing that for the next however many years. So naturally, I started to think about my next chapter. What is it that I want to do? I think I was reading on holiday again for about the third or fourth time the Simon Sinek book, Start With Why, and I was really kind of trying to think, well, what's the why? What's my why? What's my why? And trying to connect the dots with kind of, the things that I love and why I do it. And long story short, I kind of realized that the reason why I've been doing this for the last 20 odd years myself and obsessing over trying to optimize my sort of broader kind of like health and well-being is ultimately to get the most out of life for as long as possible. That was the phrase that I sort of landed on. I want to get the most out of life for as long as possible. And then sort of, I soon started to think about, well, how can I do that then? How can I do that? It's easy to do that for myself, because I didn't want to just be a personal trainer. I didn't just want to be a sort of, a nutritionist. I wanted something which was much more holistic around sort of these areas. And again, probably very pertinent to the conversation. I came home and I started to think, right, okay, what, and ultimately landed on this area of longevity. That's ultimately what it's about. It's about getting the most out of life for as long as possible. And then I started hunting around, great, if I could do a certification. And again, as we'll probably discover, that there wasn't really many things out there, sort of, even sort of two or 3 years ago, that enabled me to do that. But I did find a couple, all US based, that offered a certification as such, but I'm sure we'll get on to what that means. But yeah, I decided to sort of to lean into one of them. It was ultimately a 12-month program, but I fast tracked that, and it felt very thorough. It went through all of the biological sort of foundations and sort of basics, and then I went on and did a health and longevity coaching course at Harvard Medical School as well. And all of this just layered on top of, ultimately, as I say, 20 years of that. I don't see myself as the sum of one of those certifications. I see myself as the sum of 20 odd years of doing this kind of and practicing this kind of myself, and ultimately seeing the benefits and feeling the benefits and seeing the results. So that's what led me to kind of effectively pack in sort of 20 odd years of that sort of corporate life to then, for the second chapter, as I call it, really kind of go headlong into being a longevity coach and trying to help other people get the most out of life for as long as possible. So that's
and there's a growing demand.
There absolutely is, and a need. If we look at a lot of the stats in terms of how people are living at the moment, there's a need for it.
It's really like full circle, right? Like from marketing beer to really help people stop drinking.
I know that. And to be honest, that was one of the things when I was sort of thinking of this, because I did feel a bit of a hypocrite. Pretty much all of my years at Carlsberg, I was marketing beer, but I was teetotal. and then
I mean, it's a dissonance, right? Like it's probably that grain of sand that was able to turn into something later on in your career. So,
and if it's not alcohol, it's sugary drinks to kids and things like that. So I'm probably going to hell for doing all of those things, but
you're making amends now.
I'm going for redemption now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Darren. And Sarah, your turn. So connect to us.
Gosh. So I was a professional dancer about 35 years ago. I have always been active, and I did a transition into the fitness industry by accident rather than design. I was the lycra and leg warmers era initially, and started off being a fitness instructor that hiked my Reeboks on my boombox around London town, visiting all the different high-end clubs, doing goodness knows how many classes a week. But I also became, via a stint as a program manager, worked in operator environment as well, one of the bigger clubs in London. But I got involved in the education side of things, where I became a tutor and examiner for people who wanted to become qualified fitness instructors and personal trainers. So train the trainers, basically. And in the UK, of course, we have a sort of third level of regulation. We have the training providers, the the schools, the institutions, and then we have the providers of content, which is the regulated qualification area, and they have a government regulator. So we have layer upon layer here, and that's just in the fitness industry. But curiously, fitness instructors, the actual workforce itself remains unregulated, and that's one of the issues that we may or may not explore. And then I had a stint away in Malta. That was my husband's work, where I carried on being a personal trainer, but came back with 2 children, my own. And in that time that I was away, the landscape had slightly changed, and these awarding organisations had grown up, and I didn't, at that time, maybe similar to Darren in terms of workload, I couldn't face teaching 25 classes a week, plus turning up for the full-time job, plus. And so I was offered this role within an awarding organisation to oversee the quality assurance of the training provision. And it's, not sexy sounding at all, and regulatory compliance doesn't turn people on, and it's quite a long way from the West End and Drury Lane. But there we are, someone's got to do it. And it just made sense to me. And I got deeply involved and interested in the academic side of things. So I did a master's in educational assessment, and after a stint at Cambridge and professional qualifications in the same vein, and became Director of Quality and Standards, responsible officer, where you're directly, the point of contact, all the while making sure that the role and the standards that we offered were fit for purpose at the time, which ultimately means you've got the knowledge, the skills, the behaviours that ultimately make you employable, that, people are interested in your services. And I did that for quite a long time. And then I realised, because I was a non-executive director on the Federation of Awarding Bodies, which is, as it sounds, that I had exposed myself to an awful lot of other outside of the fitness industry organisations in similar fields with similar problems. So I set up my own consultancy, which this is my 7th year, unbelievably. But I've always, thank you, as time flies, and we're always going to pull things around to longevity and years and years. But I've always, alongside this or as part of this, been a consultant for, like, the Chartered Institute for the Management of Sport and Physical Activity over here in the UK. And at the moment, my role in Europe and beyond is the equivalent of a couple of days a week, supporting them as the role of Director of Education and Standards. So similar but broader, because culturally, regionally, policy is different, requirements are different, expectations are different, but my goodness, it's an interesting time to be alive.
Yes. And this will also play into the conversation, of course, because there will be, countries that already are running ahead a little bit with,
for sure,
regulation, I guess. So what we want to discuss, the goal of this discussion is, like, longevity coaching is now an emerging profession, and that's what you're doing right now, Darren. And I'm seeing progressively more and more longevity coaches. And Sarah and I have had a side conversation that's already on the radar in terms of an umbrella category of coaching that probably needs to be defined. So before we go into the, like, what is it, what should it be, like, what do you think is driving it? What's driving longevity coaching specifically? Because there's a lot of coaching available. Like, you can You can find a coach. You can throw a ball and hit a coach.
Yeah, that's not good news for me, I guess, if there's a lot of them, is there?
No, well, it is. If you can be very specific, I
Yeah,
think if you can define your service.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, and again, being completely sort of frank here, I've hovered and hopped a little bit around sort of whether longevity coach is the right label for for what I do. Because ultimately, you might speak to one longevity coach, and they might be sort of following the headlines, if you like,
Hmm.
and sort of ultimately sort of the Brian Johnson direction, which is kind of trying to help people hack themselves to live as long as they possibly can. That's not my kind of service. That's not my offer. That's not my definition. My definition, a bit like I said about when I kind of thought about my why, my definition is more helping people maximize their healthy years by focusing and optimizing on their habits and behaviors when it comes to their lifestyle. So it's not necessarily about extending their lifespan, although there's a natural
Hmm.
kind of knock-on effect in that. This is about extending the health span. So how many healthy years people can live by optimizing all of those lifestyle habits and behaviors. So the role of a coach, again, as I see it, isn't to diagnose or to treat any specific illnesses. I'm very clear at the outset that that's not what I do. There will be some longevity services, whether they class themselves as coaches or kind of whether they're longevity centers or longevity doctors who do offer that, where you can go into a clinic and you can get all kinds of tests and probes and all kinds of things kind of, that ultimately kind of give you a window into what's happening at that sort of deep physiological and biological level. I use data to an extent to sort of look under the hood a little bit.
Hmm.
That's mostly through things like heart rate variability, which gives a window into the autonomic nervous system. We look into sleep and recovery trends, and quality of sleep, all the things that have been scientifically proven to have a knock-on effect to cellular health, kind of, which ultimately is what drives how well or unwell we age. So I'll use that as an insight, but I'm not identifying any illnesses. I'm not diagnosing. I'm not treating any illnesses. So the role of a coach, and what I would say a longevity coach's role, is to then work in partnership with the individual, meet the individual where they're at, and ultimately be the guide, be the interpreter of information, set a roadmap for them, and hold them accountable for adopting and adhering to what ultimately they've come to you for, which is guidance and recommendations as to how they can optimize their health more. Um, so yeah, I don't know if that answers kind of the question, but that's my sort of interpretation and
I,
what I offer as a service ultimately.
yeah, I mean, I think this is really important. The definition piece is so important. Sarah, like, what do you think? What do you think is driving the longevity boom at this moment? Because it's like we need a little ecosystem here. It's like the longevity doctor, the longevity coach, the
Yeah,
longevity. Yeah.
there is. It's a very interesting proposition, and I will directly answer the question, but I want to go back and certainly not being deliberately controversial or difficult, but one of the first lectures we used to give like 25 plus years ago for people who were on the personal trainer course or fitness instructor course, whatever it was called back then. The title of it was called A Model of Total Fitness. And, the term fitness and the term personal trainer seems borderline derogatory these days, which I think is a real shame. But the model of total fitness was all about the entirety of your health profile in relation to longevity, probably, but in terms of quality of life is probably how we would have described it back then. And so it was fitness meaning physical, emotional, social, medical, and mental. All of those elements of fitness, and I think I've missed one off. Having a balance of all of those gave you your whole. So I would propose none of this is new. What's happened is information, data, technology, accessibility, and the democratization of health. So the apps, the information that we now have, run that alongside, particularly in the Western world, our failing health profile for all the reasons we could spend time on, but might not today, and how national health systems are under strain because people don't live well. And so couple all of those together, and there is opportunity, of course, but there is a desire for partnership support, for pretty more altruistic gains as much as commercial gains. I have always been on the side of trying to, for many years, to get the fitness and physical activity industry in partnership with the healthcare and allied health sectors. It's a win-win. It's a win-win. So where we have longevity is everybody is now alive to their own issues, to the risks, and to personalized information. And those that are minded to will go, God, I want to do something about this. Now, for Darren and me, it's to get on our bike at the weekend and check our Strava and, all of that kind of thing. But for others, we would be mistaken to make an assumption that they have a level of awareness or education or the words to help themselves, or accessibility to be proactive for themselves. And so that's where we meet. There was a time where we called ourselves wellness coaches or life coaches, remember them? And so now we have the sum of all of those parts, I think, in relation to what we are currently moving into the definition of longevity and longevity coaching and where that sits. So yes, it's several fold. There is partnership opportunity, there is personal benefit, there is for the greater good of the health sector and what we can do and keeping ourselves out of hospital. But as Darren said, it's the we're all in the same game. It's the life in your years, not the years in your life. Because what I think none of us would want is longevity in its purest form, i.e. let me live in any means possible to the greatest number possible, regardless of the state I'm in. And that's what we might argue might be going on in some places. And I'm not sure that answered your question, but there we go.
It's a big question, right? So it's gonna have a big answer, and actually, like, the tentacles that come out of it are the things that we're going to grab onto and go a little bit deeper. But I think you're right. Like, the intention of, like, the fitness trainer was to be very broad, but it became so narrow. Unfortunately, it became so narrow, and I think in the general consumer's mind, it is like weight training, bodybuilding is that tag still associated with many personal trainers, and there's a lot of personal trainers that don't do any favors for helping to correct that perception. There are many that work very actively against it, but
yeah.
And then I also think it's the wellness economy, right? That all of a sudden, all of those extra pillars of fitness and lifestyle medicine are now being offered because of the data that we now have access to, because we can start to steer our own KPIs a little bit more. No, that's just ridiculous. I took my Apple Watch off because I was like, I can't anymore.
Yeah.
I'm much more peaceful without a wearable.
I just took this. Took this off before the call because I thought I'd look down.
Just live the dream.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We've got the committed here. But I mean, I think the other thing is, and I think you both touched on it, is we have, a population that is sick by and large, like, and is aging. So the median age in Western Europe is 44.7, and in the UK it's 40. And like in my brief searches, just to get some good stats on this, there's 1 person in 4 above 40 that is suffering from a lifestyle disease. So there's a lot of people that are not feeling good, and they're being confronted with their mortality, and they're probably being confronted with the healthcare system, and the fact that there's not a whole lot that they're not equipped to give them tools to be proactive. So in my synthesis of what you're both saying, and what I think as well, it's this perfect storm of people are looking for solutions, and healthcare can't give them solutions. And there's this whole breed of services, including doctors, that you can go to privately that can start to offer solutions. But to your definition of what you offer, Darren, the doctors aren't coaching. Like, they're gonna still act like doctors. They'll give you the interpretation, they'll give you the recommendation, but that behavioral piece is still up to you. So I think that's the area and the space that is definitely needs to be claimed, because people need that bridge.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and I do think, just back to some of what Sarah was saying and what you were saying there about gym. I mean, I do think gyms have probably a once in a generation sort of opportunity to capitalize on this, if they really wanted to turn gyms from being just about working on your aesthetics to actually kind of whole body health and systems. They've, to a certain extent, got the infrastructure there to become longevity centers rather than just fitness centers. And you do see some boutique ones opening up, particularly around kind of major kind of urban sort of centers. But I think, again, it probably comes back to, obviously, and this is kind of this is Sarah's kind of wheelhouse and remit. It's kind of, are the people who are there at the moment sort of qualified, or kind of even have the mindset to be able to then shift and transition into that, because it's still quite a big leap to go from talking about a sort of a fitness program to purpose and kind of social connections and sort of relationships and all of those other kind of emotional wellness aspects that we do know now, sort of through the science, actually does impact you at a physiological and a sort of cellular level as well. So it would be a big shift, but the way I see it, and this isn't to talk people like myself out of a role, we do have kind of loads of potential longevity centers kind of all over the country and all over the world. It's just sort of still quite narrow at the moment, which does open the door to potentially kind of some of the sort of more extreme sort of offers and services that we see, which I think is part of your question, sort of, Jennifer, about why is this sort of becoming more and more of a thing now. I do think that it's quite often those that drive kind of quite a lot of the interest and the headlines that then perpetuate the media articles. I don't know whether it's just the algorithm that I feed, but on Apple News on a daily basis, there's kind of a plethora of articles on sort of longevity and how to age, how to live to 100, the 5 exercises to do to live to, and all of these kind of things. There are so many of these things, and I contribute some of those, because I write some of those articles that appear on Apple News. But they do kind of want the the clickbait and the sound bites to kind of to get people kind of into that. And a lot of the centres that I'm seeing featured in some of these articles. There was one the other day, I think, in one of the kind of major newspapers, and they are the physical sort of Harley Street or off Harley Street sort of centres that go and people pay 15 grand to get a full body sort of MOT, but that creates the content to be able to then sort of for feed and sort of perpetuate. I think this is an area that's really interesting, but to a lot of people is still quite out of reach. And that's again sort of something, but that's mostly sort of financially. That's something that I wanted to be able to do as part of how I grow and how I sort of offer my services, is to try and democratize some of this, because I do think for too long it's been sort of the preserve of the elite and the wealthy who can afford to get this. And this is where I want to sort of try and educate people that you don't need to spend 15 grand or a 20 grand or a sort of 50 grand a year subscription to one of these kind of companies, when 90% of what's going to shift the dial for you are the things that you have full control of at home. And so, I think that's kind of a message that is getting lost. Maybe it's coming up a little bit at the moment, but I still think longevity is still seen as sort of a little bit on a pedestal, and sort of whereas there's an opportunity to democratize it, I think.
Yeah, if I can just come in on that point, I'm really pleased you said that, Darren. A personal concern for me about longevity coaching is that, yes, longevity for those that can afford it as a proposition. And in the UK, we have something called social prescribing, which is where I think longevity should sit. And that's where there is this intersection with the healthcare service, because of course we do know that fix the basics, if you understand what basics need fixing for you, is absolutely accessible for all. But if we package it up as something that's, this is special, therefore this is expensive, then we're fooling ourselves about the need, because the need will sit with those that could afford it anyway and probably live a higher quality of life more generally. That's where I think we need to be cautious in a lot of ways, really.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, yeah.
No.
Yeah, and again, sort of, and we may come on to this, but I think that then has a potential knock-on effect of damaging the reputation of longevity. Not only sort of, not only that, but not just in the realm of coaching or, but it's also in the realm of supplements and sort of all of these kind of ancillary businesses linked to longevity that are popping up all over the place at the moment. The amount of supplements, and it's again it's something that I'm very, very cautious of, but longevity drugs, the rapamycin or the metformins or the NMN or kind of NR and all of these sort of things that don't have enough long-term human trials and evidence to be able to kind of see whether they actually have any benefit, or actually are harmful. So they're the things that I'll personally, because again, I wouldn't put them in my system until I know more about them. So I'm not going to recommend them or use them with my clients. But there are sort of well proven supplements, be it magnesium or be it B12 or sort of the things that people are largely deficient of still, that very much have a role. But I think there's a danger of all the companies that, if you're scrolling through Instagram, there's suddenly a new kind of company there that's kind of supplement company selling sort of all of their sort of magic pills and potions, which again have the potential to to discredit this whole area, I think.
I mean, the growth of this this economy is huge, right? Like the overall wellness economy, and you can't look at it under a microscope because it is all interconnected. And I think it's the fact that there's so much money that is going towards this, and the fact that, you know, our population isn't going to get any younger and probably not going to get any healthier. And we as people are terrified of the idea of death and mortality. And we've been chasing immortality, through millennia. So, and this is just our generation's, attempt to chase immortality.
Ironically, our generation would rather find that in a pill than maybe the things that our kind of previous generations did, which was move around more and sort of eat more natural foods and, and get outside more.
Sure. Yeah, I know. I mean, and you mentioned that, and you both mentioned that. It's like the foundation, your healthy foundation is really boring. It's go to bed early, it's move regularly, it's eat foods that don't come out of packaging. You probably don't need most supplements if you do those things. Spend time away from your device, connecting with people in real life. Go out in fresh air. Like that's the thing. And what's difficult is people are needing coaches for those behaviors, because our world has changed so much that those basics to us aren't basic. We have anymore.
Entrenched, where we have to unpick an awful lot in our daily routines, and it is tough. It is tough. To undo habits.
Yeah, and and again, I've seen that sort of, with some clients, who have the evidence there, they know the evidence, but it's still really hard work for them to, to get them to stand up and move away from their screen every 45 minutes, just for 5 minutes, and move around, or, not to have their lunch in front of the screens, and, all of these things, as you say, which should be basic, but people don't have the discipline. We live in such a hyper-vigilant world where there's always a distraction that's going to pull them away from sort of doing all of those kind of things.
Yeah.
So, I'd argue that's probably now more than ever, as our brains are being hardwired to have shorter attention spans and all of these kind of things, people actually do need somebody looking over their shoulder saying, actually, you need to be doing this now. You need to be doing this.
Yeah. And a human that would be So like who's coming to you for longevity coaching? Like what are they looking for, without obviously revealing who they are? Sure. But what are their complaints? What are you working with them on? Like, how do they define longevity, and how did they find you?
So there's still quite a broad range, but I guess the majority, and I don't know whether this is also kind of based on the sort of where I actually kind of, get most of my leads coming through from, they tend to be in that sort of 40 to 60, sort of, again, sort of, professional sort of background, people who are or kind of have been in relatively high performing kind of roles themselves. They've already got a mindset that they want to actually keep performing, but feel like the general sort of thread that runs through them all is they can't quite put their finger on why they just don't feel quite as vital as they used to. They feel like they're kind of, their energy levels aren't there anymore. They feel like they're waking up and they're a bit foggy and sort of not as sharp as they were. They feel like they're doing all the right things, so most of them are going to the gym. Most of them are more often than not kind of eating sort of, healthily by kind of a broad definition of the word. They probably feel like they're getting enough sleep. But again, that's a whole area that you dive into. But, if somebody goes to bed at 11 o'clock and gets up at sort of 6 o'clock, they're like, yeah, I get 7 hours sleep. but they don't actually get 7 hours sleep. That's just when so, but again, they feel like they're doing all the right things. So they can't figure out why they don't actually feel great. And again,
like they're 25 anymore.
yeah. And again, the gray area in this, I guess, for a lot of people is I'm not unwell, but I just don't feel. Yeah. I mean, some people will say I don't feel well, and they'll go to maybe with work they'll get a health screening, and they'll go and they'll get the screening, and all the results will come back, and they'll have half an hour with the doctor, and sort of and everything will be fine. There might be a couple of little things, a bit of cholesterol sort of slightly elevated and things like that, but they'll come away and they'll by the usual definitions have kind of ticks in all the boxes that you're absolutely fine, but they still come away kind of thinking, but I don't feel great, I still feel really really foggy, and I still feel kind of off, and but but what they don't know is that actually sort of maybe they're trying to compensate for feeling like that by sort of loading on caffeine or kind of sugary snacks, or they're trying to build their energy by kind of exercising more vigorously, but that's actually draining their battery even more. So there are all of these parts of the jigsaw that we've all learned over many years of these are the right things to do, and people are kind of trying to build the jigsaw sort of in their own sort of way, but it's how it all comes together which is ultimately going to make the difference as to how well they're feeling. So that tends to typify kind of my client. They're not unwell, they've not got any major health problems, but they just don't feel great. And when you start to kind of work with them, the answers quite often become obvious. And when you do use some of the data behind it as well, some of the objective data, although subjective data is often more useful than objective data, but sort of the objective data that I use in particular really kind of makes it fairly clear what's happening, which is again why I talked earlier about the labels and things like that. I guess ultimately what I deal the most with is that area of giving people their vitality and their energy back. It's not necessarily once I'm working with clients, we actually don't talk about longevity a great deal. That's almost a byproduct of, okay, we can get your energy and your vitality and your sharpness back now, and you'll feel you'll almost immediately, or kind of within a few months, you'll feel great. But then it's a case of how do we then build the habits and the behaviors and the systems so that you're able to now keep hold of this energy for as long as possible, for decades to come. And that's where the longevity sort of comes into it. I don't think many people are actually coming to me with a longevity problem or looking for a longevity solution. They're looking for a solution to something that's actually bleeding neck for them now, which is, I'm feeling pretty crap. What can we do about it? But then the conversation is kind of, keeping like that for as long as possible so that you can keep thriving for the second half. So that's kind of the sweet spot, if you like, of clients. I do get sort of some older people coming to me, so people in their 80s, and you can still, there's lots that you can still, do with people in their 80s.
Sure.
Again, sort of, but it takes a certain person, I think, in their 80s to come to me and have an open enough mind to start strength training, for example, in their 80s. There aren't many of those around. But people should theoretically be coming to me sort of, in their mid-30s. That's typically when the sort of mindset shifts, I think, from I keep fit and it's very aesthetically driven to, okay, I'm thinking about the future a little bit more, and maybe I'm not quite as kind of fit as I maybe was, or I don't feel like I can recover as quickly as I was, and young families and all the things like that impact on it. That's typically when the tide changes, about 35. So I do have some younger as well, but yeah, the heartland is that middle 40 to 60.
That's really interesting. It makes sense because you've got that midlife, I don't know, stomach punch that happens in terms of your energy level, clarity, and vitality. And I think it's really cool that they're coming to you to look at the whole picture. And I think that's really, I started my fitness career as a personal trainer and continued for many years as a personal trainer. And you do obviously get into your client's life outside the gym because it impacts their performance. But that's not what you're leading with. You're leading with the gym, and then you sort of spread out into the other things that are impacting. But what it sounds like you're doing is the other way around. We're starting with the big picture, which is actually how it should have been, from the beginning. And I can imagine that when you're working with a client base in this age group, that they probably some of them have some pre-existing conditions. So it would be great if you could have a good cooperation with the other parts of their health team. Is that happening for you?
Yeah, not too much. There's a couple I'm thinking, sort of, one in particular, sort of really at the moment that has had sort of, but it's quite a long time ago, kind of, some fairly sort of major health issues, on medication for that sort of still. So I have to be very mindful of kind of how I sort of work with that, not to push the immune system, which is still kind of quite compromised too high, but actually how I build that up. But again, I'm always and will be kind of, very clear that, if we are seeing something that sort of suggests he might actually benefit from certain, so magnesium was one, for example, that kind of, from the blood test looked like he was kind of deficient. I will always make sure that he's actually working with his specialist on that before kind of, that happens. So yeah, I think there is an opportunity more broadly for partnerships, if you like, where there's someone who is a qualified medical professional, a doctor who's taking a more proactive rather than a reactive approach to health, that I can then sort of work hand in hand with to as you said earlier, to make sure we're guiding them then through the implementation of it.
Yep.
But I don't
like a team.
Yeah, there's not much of that happening, I don't think, at the moment.
I think that's always been the bridge that we've been missing, right, Sarah? Like, this has been the wish for many years, but I think it's just the system isn't designed for that. It's not designed for proactivity.
No, really good observation. And Darren, great to hear that of course you would not stray around outside of your scope of practice. That's hopefully a given in any professional circumstance. The it's by accident rather than design, really, Jen, of course, because you would think it was common sense that people would have a network of referrals, specialists outside of your own scope of practice. And indeed, when you are qualified and want to join the Register of Exercise Professionals, one of the requirements is, and it is for the training providers who are accredited by us, to sign a code of ethical conduct, which absolutely commits you to go, you stray only to the border and not beyond, and know where to go beyond that. But it's interesting, actually, something that was talked about earlier was the, what's in a name. Personal trainers, I think I said it a while ago, I feel sorry for them for the term. Interestingly, I had a long conversation with a huge multi-site gym chain yesterday, and they were thinking out loud about the term itself. Do we really even call them that anymore? What is it we should be calling them? Because they recognize the expanding role, which I think is a really positive move, and that is happening in various of the larger operators, really, not least because they recognize the changing demographic. But in relation to the what you do and don't do, that's where professional standards as prescribed come into their own, really. And you may be interested to know, last year the European professional standard for personal training was updated in terms of its scope of practice to reflect some of the small changes. But what's important to remember is that these market entry professional standards are exactly that. It's like the driving license. You get your core. We have all agreed these are the minimum requirements to get going in this kind of career. And then I would say as well that not all personal trainers want to be longevity coaches. Some want to be strength and conditioning coaches. Some want to specialize in older adults, long-term conditions, cancer rehab, pre and postnatal, whatever. So I think we should absolutely recognize that there is this smorgasbord of opportunity within the health and fitness and physical activity industry. And as long as people are qualified as far as they can be to carry out the role that they want to, then we can have some assurance, and most importantly, the public can have confidence and that they are safe in our hands. So that's I suppose that's the important message. But we have this challenge of this emerging role. I say challenge, it wasn't a challenge, it's a great thing, but it's about how we define that as a fantastic opportunity for those who want to take their baseline a bit further, who want to explore, who want to go into these markets and have that kind of clientele as well. So it's about understanding what it is a personal trainer can do in partnership and what they can do on their own as well. And in Europe, we have 15 standards, which start with the core occupational standards of fitness instructor and personal trainer. But this year we do have, which is just being revised and relaunched, exercise for health coach. And they call it the coach to reflect the nuanced, not so nuanced, loaded term of personal trainer. I think it's really positive, and it captures certain aspects in relation to physiology, immune systems, long-term conditions, other things that people come with, quality of sleep, all the baseline metrics, but the role of exercise and physical activity on all of these things. So it just steps up a level for a qualified coach to step into that market. So it's definitely interesting times, but we haven't used longevity. And the other thing I want to just sort of circle back to, when Darren, we were talking about wellness, and I was thinking, well, why? Because for a lot of the time we talk about wellness and wellness coaching and stuff, which sort of came slightly before and is still around in relation to longevity. And I was thinking, wellness is a sort of transient state, isn't it? I'm well today and I might not be tomorrow, and there are different factors. Whereas wellness is a facet of longevity, isn't it, or a factor? And longevity is as you say, the bigger picture. And we should all be pumped and primed to be able to describe it and offer it, and look after the people that come our way in a safe environment.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering, and this is just me wondering, probably disruptively out loud, the way I hear you describe it, Sarah, is that longevity should go somewhere in the ecosystem of physical coaching, like exercise coaching. And I'm wondering, should it, or should it be its own umbrella? I mean, what I hear you say is that you have to have a clear scope of practice so that you can have the education to support the scope of practice, and then a commitment to a scope of practice, and then eventually an accreditation to do you meet the requirements, right? Like that's basically the pillars of what needs to happen for professionalization.
Yeah, I wouldn't. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, because that would require longevity to be much more succinctly described, and I think it's a much broader church than that. And I'm certainly not in a land grab at all.
No,
And
no,
if you
no, no. Where does it go? You know, where do you
yeah,
put
yeah. So, well, I mean, if you're talking about professional recognition, it could go anywhere. You have like, for example, the College of Natural Medicine. They have longevity and wellness, and they have an area, I think, towards where Darren is going, or where your area sits. There is in the UK the Health and Care Practitioners Council. So they are a very broad church for everything other than doctors and nurses, I guess you would say. So I would just want to see longevity, first of all, properly recognised. It isn't a protected term. What might surprise people is that we talk about working in clinical environments and clinicians and clinics, and that isn't a protected term either. That's my only area of nervousness, when we stray into quasi-medicalized language where we have no place to be. And we shouldn't be making and to be very clear, Darren, you're not, and you weren't, but there are people that might be tempted, a bit like when you are a nutritionist and you stray into dietetics and things like that. There are very, very clear lines of definition in terms of scope of practice. So I don't want people to be misled or misunderstood. And personal trainers are personal trainers. I mean, we do stereotype, you think of an image and you put them in a gym. Just to note, I did an awful lot of mine outside in parks, as people do. But it's true, isn't it? But we do. It's like when we use the term coach. Coaching is actually predominantly, historically, been associated with sport rather than fitness. So we put terms in a box at our peril, but we do tend to, for marketing purposes, and to separate ourselves from those. I'm not that kind of coach, so it's a challenge, and it will be. And as longevity grows as an industry, just like Instagram did, there will be well-defined roles, coaches, offers, output in a safe, clean, and well understood way. And there'll be the muddy edges, just as there are in personal training in the fitness industry, in all industries. So I just we need a a lexicon, a language that is well understood in the way that we think personal training and the fitness industry is understood. Longevity is fairly nascent in its modern guise, and we're still building an understanding around that, and where all of these different versions of itself are going to grow.
Yeah.
Really.
And I personally wish there was a clearer kind of definition of it. And what I think to an extent would help is if longevity does end up being purely about life extension, or kind of how long you can live, and it probably does then lead more towards the longevity medicine sort of side of things rather than longevity coaching, because the probably the closest of the new terms to what I do is more the health span, but that's again adding another bit of jargon in there that sort of people probably understand less about than longevity. So I think maybe with time longevity will be cut up even further, so that longevity does become more directly associated with that sort of more clinical or extreme sort of interventions that are about extending lifespan. And because I guess ultimately what I do is maybe not quite as often used in the UK is maybe in the US, but it's more like holistic. So I'm a kind of holistic health coach, but I hate that term, because again, it kind of,
Sounds too
yeah, it
woo.
does, it
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
But that's ultimately kind of, what it directly sort of is very closely related to, at least anyway, sort of there. But so we do have all of these terms. And, as somebody who's only been in this for 2 years, I'm in all honesty still trying to kind of, find myself kind of like what's the label that I give myself? What's the box that not only feels um, feels a good description of what I do, but actually people understand as well, because that's the marketeer, that's the marketeer hat on, from old.
Yeah.
When you have to explain what longevity means, because
Too much.
most of my friends, I don't know whether they do it just to take the mickey or kind of what, most of my friends still think longevity is about living forever. And I'm kind of like, trying to say like, oh, so what you're doing now to try and live forever? It's not about that. It's about living well for as long as you can, and sort of, and aging well. Because I've tried that as well, a little bit in some descriptions, a healthy aging coach. But what I found is that very, very much did skew me towards 65 plus.
Older.
Yeah. Whereas healthy
Yeah,
aging.
because as soon as you say aging, you've got to get the category where you're like, yes, that's
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And before that, nobody wants that
Yeah.
label.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that longevity is the term that's rooted at this point. Like the World Economic Forum has a definition for the category. Investors have 4 different umbrellas that they're investing in under longevity. So like there's infrastructure around this word, and there's definition around this word, and I think it's just going to be continually loaded. So just to wrap things up, and just to have your opinions and maybe even wish in this area, like who should own it? Like where should it go? Where does the longevity coach, the longevity services, where should they fall under, and what adjacency can it tap into to start getting a little bit of that professional backbone?
On that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I'll have a go. Actually, when people think about what's wrong with them and wellness and longevity and please fix these things, you would think it would sit within the healthcare system, because it's so tightly associated with the first cousins of pharmacology. Pharmaceuticals, I'm afraid, that's where it will probably be pulled into in a lot of ways. However, on the ground at the coalface, doctors are busy and overworked, clinics are full, and they will spend time fixing what's in front of them in the most convenient and efficient way round. What we want to do is to have this adjacent space where actually we are, and by we, I'm capturing Darren, and the living well and physical activity and wellness. And I go all the way back to my initial proposition of a 30-year-old lecture I used to do, and that absolutely was sold as the holistic model of fitness, and that we would own the space as partners, because I think what we're trying to do is to try and silo off. And we know that nothing works without each other, and it should absolutely be a collaborative and a bit more collegiate, to be honest with you. So it's the direction of traffic we need to sort out. I think everybody should own the space, because everybody has a subtle and important, mutually important role to play.
Puzzle piece.
But
Yeah.
yeah, but it's which way the traffic is pushed. It's the push and pull factors across the 2 sectors, really. For me, that's quite a superficial way, but I'm envisaging it.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with that. I think the only aspect that I think is needed, and this is purely from a how do you impact as many people as possible positively, in terms of how do you, positively, I can't even say it, positively impact as many people's health as possible. I do think it needs some form of higher level kind of backing and endorsement, whatever that might be, or kind of affiliation to scale this, because if not, I think longevity will stay, as we talked about earlier, will stay kind of as a term that everybody might sort of sounds to be quite excited about, and investors will be investing in tech and things like that, but it will stay niche, and it will stay the niche of kind of an exclusive group of people. And I think, again, I see this myself as a coach, who's looking and talking to all different kinds of sort of customers. It is still an abstract thing to grasp, and it's not a pressing need for the majority of people. People aren't interested in what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years' time. It's just not yet human nature. There'll be some people who tend to be those kind of high performers, which again is probably why it naturally gravitates to the sort of the real high performers and the wealthy at the moment, because they've got that mindset where they're always wanting to kind of extend and push and sort of on to the next thing, whereas 99% of people still want to fix something now, but they don't necessarily kind of have the bandwidth, the means, kind of whatever it is, to fix something that's going to be a problem in 20 years' time. So I do think some connection needs to be made to help people understand the things that you're doing now, and the sort of the symptoms that you might be feeling, those things that just feel a little bit off. They're not illnesses, but they're dysfunctions that will become illnesses in sort of 15 or 20 years' time. And at that point, sort of, it might be too late. And so connecting the two worlds, where if the NHS is reactive and if this world is kind of proactive, I think is needed. But I just, again, I'm not educated enough to know how to connect them. But there is some form of mandate sort of needed, sort of from whether it's at the NHS level or kind of whatever, to actually incorporate this as something kind of into that world that ultimately, as we all know, will ease the burden on the NHS if it actually is connected up properly. But yeah, that's Sarah's job.
Well, thank you both so much for having this rumbly conversation, because it's one of those topics that is a bit obtuse at the moment, and we need to start like zooming in and unpacking it. So I think this is step one. There's probably 100 more steps that follow this, but we've opened the Pandora's box, and hopefully we can start at least continuing the conversation and then taking steps.
Yeah,
because it's definitely needed. There's a huge opportunity. So thank you both for your time and your expertise. I really enjoyed our discussion.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good to see you. Thanks very much.
Thanks for tuning in to Connecting the Dots. If today sparked a new idea, helped shift your thinking, or gave you something to take forward, share it, rate the show, or drop us a message. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next conversation. Until then, keep connecting the dots that matter.